When an 8-year-old girl walked into the abandoned log mansion everyone feared, they laughed and called her foolish. But buried beneath the rotting floorboards lay a tunnel system hiding $275 million in gold, cash, and priceless artifacts. And that little girl's courage would expose secrets powerful people had killed to protect. Before we explore this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to Hollow Creek like a secret no one wanted to tell. 8-year-old Emma Harris pressed her nose against the school bus window, watching the old log mansion pass by for the 1,000th time. It sat atop Morrison Hill like a sleeping giant, its massive timber walls dark with age, its windows black and empty as forgotten promises. The structure was enormous, built from logs so thick 3 children couldn't wrap their arms around them. Local legend said it had been constructed in 1892 by the Whitmore family, timber barons who'd owned half the county before the Great Depression swallowed their fortune whole. "Don't even think about it," warned her seatmate, a boy named Tommy who'd lived in Hollow Creek his whole life. "My dad says people who go in there don't come back right. Says something happened there back in '33. People died." Emma didn't answer. She just watched until the mansion disappeared behind a wall of pines, her reflection ghosting across the glass like she was already halfway there. The other kids whispered about ghosts and curses, about screams heard on windy nights and lights that flickered in windows that had no power. But Emma didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in forgotten things, in secrets, in the way people turned their backs on beautiful things just because they were old or scared or tired of remembering. At home that afternoon, Emma found her grandmother Ruth in the kitchen, flour dusting her weathered hands as she stretched dough across the counter. Ruth was 68, but moved like someone who'd learned long ago that stopping meant giving up. The house smelled like rising bread and wood smoke, like all the meals stretched to feed 2 people on a pension meant for 1. They lived in a small rental cottage at the edge of town, the kind with wallpaper peeling in the corners and floorboards that creaked stories of everyone who'd ever walked them. "How was school, sweetheart?" Ruth asked, without looking up, her hands working the dough with practiced rhythm. "Fine," Emma said, dropping her backpack by the door. She moved to the window and stared up at Morrison Hill, where the log mansion loomed dark against the autumn sky. "Grandma, why doesn't anyone live in the big house anymore?" Ruth's hands stilled. She wiped flour on her apron and turned to face Emma, her eyes carrying that particular sadness that came from knowing too much. "That house has been empty since before I was born, child. The Whitmore family left during the Depression. Some say they lost everything. Others say they ran from something worse than poverty." "Like what?" Ruth shook her head. "Old stories. Dark stories. The kind that keep people away for good reason." But Emma heard something else in her grandmother's voice. Not fear, but grief. Like Ruth mourned the house's abandonment rather than celebrated it. That night, as Emma lay in bed listening to the October wind rattle their windows, she thought about all the things people abandoned. Her mother had abandoned them 3 years ago, leaving Emma with Ruth because addiction had been a stronger pull than love. Her father had never been in the picture at all. The kids at school abandoned her at lunch, whispering about the girl who lived with her grandma in the falling-down cottage, who wore the same 3 outfits rotated through the week, whose shoes had holes covered with duct tape. Maybe that's why Emma felt drawn to the mansion. It was abandoned too, forgotten, left behind. The next Saturday, while Ruth worked her shift at the grocery store, Emma made her decision. She packed a small backpack, flashlight, a bottle of water, her grandfather's old pocket knife that Ruth kept in the kitchen drawer, and a notebook she'd been saving for something important. This felt important. The walk to Morrison Hill took 40 minutes. The path was overgrown, choked with blackberry vines and wild roses that grabbed at her jacket. No one had walked this way in years, maybe decades. The closer she got, the larger the mansion grew, until it blocked out the sun entirely, and Emma stood in its shadow, neck craned back, mouth open. Up close, the log house was even more magnificent than she'd imagined. The logs were massive, hand-hewn, fitted together with a precision that spoke of craftsmen who'd cared about their work. The front door stood 12 feet tall, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and animals. Vines had claimed the walls, winding up toward a stone chimney that rose 4 stories into the grey sky. Windows stretched floor to ceiling on the first level, their glass somehow still intact despite decades of abandonment. Emma tried the front door, locked. She circled the house, testing windows, finding them all sealed tight. But at the back, where the land sloped away and the foundation rose higher, she found a cellar door angled into the hillside. The wood had rotted through in one corner, leaving a gap just wide enough for a small girl to squeeze through. She hesitated only a moment before dropping to her stomach and wiggling through the opening. The smell hit her first. Damp earth, old stone and something else, something like metal and time. She clicked on her flashlight and stood slowly, brushing dirt from her jeans. The cellar was enormous. Stone walls rose to timber beams overhead, and the space stretched back into darkness, farther than her flashlight could reach. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, grey with dust. Wooden crates were stacked along one wall, their labels faded to nothing. Mason jars lined rough-hewn shelves, their contents long since turned to shadow. Emma moved carefully, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. She expected to feel afraid, but instead she felt something close to recognition, like this place had been waiting for her specifically. She walked past rows of stored belongings, a child's rocking horse, its paint peeling, a stack of leather-bound books swollen with moisture, a trunk with brass fittings gone green with age. At the back of the cellar, where the darkness grew thicker and the air colder, she found something that made her stop. A wall that didn't match the others. While the rest of the foundation was built from rough stone, this section was smooth, carefully mortared, almost hidden behind a stack of empty barrels that looked deliberately placed. Emma pulled the barrels aside one by one, her small arms straining with the effort. Behind them, the wall revealed itself fully, and set into that wall, nearly invisible unless you knew to look, was an iron door. It was small, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, with hinges that had been oiled recently enough that they didn't look rusted. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she reached out and touched the cold metal. No lock, just a simple latch. She looked behind her at the cellar stretching back toward the sliver of daylight where she'd entered. She could leave now. Go home. Tell Ruth she'd taken a walk in the woods. Forget she'd ever found this place. That's what a smart girl would do. That's what a careful girl would do. But Emma had never been particularly smart or careful. She'd always been curious. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward with a groan that sounded like the house itself exhaling. Beyond it, a tunnel stretched into absolute darkness, its walls carved from the living earth, its ceiling shored up with timber beams. The air that rushed out was cold and dry, carrying a scent of stone and something else, something that made Emma think of her grandmother's jewelry box, the one with the velvet lining that smelled like old coins and secrets. Emma checked her flashlight battery, took a deep breath, and stepped through the doorway. The tunnel descended at a gentle angle, the floor packed earth worn smooth, as if many feet had walked this path. Emma counted her steps, 10, 20, 30, until she lost track and just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The walls were closer than the cellar, close enough that she could touch both sides if she stretched her arms out. Support beams appeared every few feet, rough-cut timber that looked old but solid. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes, the tunnel opened into a chamber. Emma swept her flashlight across the space and gasped. The room was roughly 20 feet square, with walls lined in brick rather than earth. And on those walls, shelves had been built. On those shelves sat items that made Emma's breath catch. Gold coins stacked in neat columns, paper money bound in bundles, their bills crisp despite the years, wooden boxes with brass latches, leather pouches that clinked when Emma carefully touched them. And hanging on the far wall, protected by glass in an ornate frame, was a painting of a woman in a blue dress, her eyes following Emma wherever she moved. Emma approached the nearest shelf slowly, reverently. She picked up one of the gold coins, its weight surprising in her small hand. Even in the dim light of her flashlight, it gleamed. She turned it over and saw the date. 1928. She picked up another, 1931, another, 1925. On a small table in the center of the room sat a leather journal, its cover embossed with initials, J.W. Emma opened it carefully. The pages crackled with age, but the handwriting was clear, strong, deliberate. January 15th, 1933, the first entry read, "I have made the decision. The banks have failed. The government cannot be trusted. Everything we built, everything father and grandfather secured, will be lost if I do not act. I have spent the last 6 months preparing this sanctuary. Only Margaret knows the truth, and she has sworn to keep it. The tunnels beneath the house, built by grandfather for reasons he never explained, will serve their purpose at last. I estimate we have secured 4 million in gold, 8 million in currency, and assets I cannot begin to calculate. When the storm passes, we will return. Until then, let the world think the Whitmores have fallen." Emma turned the page with trembling fingers. Entry after entry detailed the hiding of the family fortune, the construction of additional chambers, the careful documentation of every item secured. The writer, J.W., wrote about his wife Margaret, about their 3 children, about the workers he paid in cash to help with the construction and then sent away before the final sealing. The final entry was dated October 3rd, 1933. Margaret is dead. Tuberculosis took her in 3 days, swift and merciless. The children are sick now too. Victoria and James grow weaker by the hour. Only Sarah seems to fight it. I have called for the doctor, but he says there is nothing to be done. The house is quarantined. No one will come. I realize now that in my desperation to save our fortune, I have imprisoned my family. The money means nothing if I lose them. If anyone finds this journal, know that I did what I thought was right. Know that I loved them more than gold. The fortune is yours. Use it better than I did. James Whitmore. Emma sat back, her hands shaking. She swept her flashlight around the chamber again, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just a vault. It was a tomb of dreams, a monument to fear and love and desperate decisions. She carefully closed the journal and looked at the shelves of gold and cash. In 1933, 4 million in gold and 8 million in currency would have been an incomprehensible fortune. Now, decades later, with the value of gold alone having skyrocketed, not to mention the historical value of the artifacts, the paintings, the rare coins, Emma didn't know exactly what it was worth, but she knew it was more money than most people could imagine. And she knew something else. This wasn't hers to take, but it also wasn't right for it to stay buried, forgotten, while the descendants of James Whitmore, if there were any, lived without knowing. While Hollow Creek crumbled with poverty and lost hope, a fortune sat beneath a house everyone feared. Emma took out her notebook and began to write, documenting everything she saw. She copied passages from James Whitmore's journal. She sketched crude maps of the tunnel and chamber. She made lists of the items on the shelves, counting as best she could in the dim light. 2 hours later, she carefully made her way back through the tunnel, through the cellar, and out into the grey afternoon light. She replaced the barrels in front of the wall, covering her tracks. She squeezed back through the gap in the cellar door and stood in the cool autumn air, looking up at the massive log house. "I'll be back," she whispered to it. "And I'm bringing help." When Emma got home, Ruth was in the kitchen peeling potatoes for dinner, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd performed the same task 10,000 times. She looked up when Emma walked in, her eyes sharp despite her age. "You've been somewhere you shouldn't have been," Ruth said simply. It wasn't a question. Emma set her backpack on the table and pulled out her notebook. "Grandma, I need to tell you something, and I need you to believe me." Ruth set down her peeler and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at Emma for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Sit down, child. Tell me." So Emma told her everything. The cellar, the tunnel, the chamber, the journal, the fortune. She showed Ruth her notes, her sketches, the dates she'd copied. She told her about James Whitmore and his family, about the tuberculosis and the desperate choice and the final words written in that leather journal. When Emma finished, Ruth sat in silence for a full minute. Then she stood, walked to the window, and stared up at Morrison Hill where the mansion loomed dark against the darkening sky. "I knew there was something," Ruth said quietly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Whitmores. Said they didn't just disappear like everyone claimed. Said something tragic happened in that house. Said James Whitmore loved his family more than anything in the world, but fear made him foolish." She turned back to Emma. "People are going to say you're lying. They're going to say a child made it all up for attention. Some are going to say you're trespassing and try to scare you silent. Others are going to try to take it from you." "It's not mine to take," Emma said firmly. "But it's also not right for it to just stay there. Mr. Whitmore wanted it found. He said so in his journal." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then we're going to need help. The right kind of help. The kind that won't steal from a child or twist the truth for profit." "Who?" Emma asked. Ruth thought for a moment, then reached for the phone book, the actual paper phone book that sat on the counter because they couldn't afford internet. She flipped through the yellow pages until she found what she was looking for. "First," Ruth said, "we call the Historical Society. They'll know how to verify what you found and who has legal claim to it. Then we call Sheriff Parker. He's honest, and he'll make sure nobody tries anything stupid before the law sorts this out." Emma nodded, but her stomach churned with anxiety. Once they made those calls, everything would change. The secret would be out. The peaceful silence of that underground chamber would be broken forever. But then she thought of James Whitmore's final words in that journal. "Use it better than I did." "Make the calls," Emma said. Ruth smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That's my girl." Within an hour, 3 people were sitting in Ruth's tiny living room. Sheriff Parker, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a weather-beaten face. Dr. Morrison, who ran the County Historical Society and was so excited he could barely sit still. And Margaret Cole, an attorney who'd grown up in Hollow Creek and returned after law school because she believed small towns deserved good lawyers. Emma told her story again, showed her notes again, answered questions until her voice grew hoarse. Dr. Morrison examined her sketches with trembling hands. Margaret took detailed notes. Sheriff Parker listened with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When Emma finished, Dr. Morrison spoke first. "If what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, young lady, you may have made one of the most significant historical discoveries in this county's history. The Whitmore family was thought to have fled west during the Depression. There's been speculation for decades about what happened to their fortune, but most people assumed they lost everything like everyone else. The question, Margaret said carefully, is what happens next. Emma, you found this fortune, but you don't own the property. The house belongs to the state now, I believe, seized for unpaid taxes sometime in the 1970s. That means technically nothing until we verify the find, Sheriff Parker interrupted. I'm not letting anybody rush into that house until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Dr. Morrison, can you research the Whitmore family tree? See if there are any living descendants who might have claim. Already planning to start tonight, Dr. Morrison said eagerly. Good. Margaret, you make sure Emma and Ruth are protected legally. Make sure they're documented as the discoverers, and that any finder's fee or historical documentation reward goes to them, not some county bureaucrat or treasure hunter. Margaret nodded. I'll file paperwork first thing Monday morning. Sheriff Parker turned to Emma. You did something brave today, kid, but also something dangerous. That house has been sitting empty for almost 100 years. Those tunnels could collapse. There could be other hazards. I need you to promise me you won't go back there without me or another adult. Can you promise that? Emma nodded solemnly. I promise. Good. He stood, and the others followed. I'll post a deputy at the property tonight. Make sure nobody else goes poking around until we can organize a proper survey. Dr. Morrison, I'll need you there tomorrow morning. Bring whatever equipment you need. After they left, Ruth made hot chocolate, and she and Emma sat at the kitchen table in silence for a while, the weight of what had happened settling over them like snow. Are you scared? Ruth asked finally. Emma thought about it. A little, but also excited. Grandma, that money, if it's real, if it's worth what Dr. Morrison thinks, it could change everything. For us, for the town, for everyone. Money changes things, Ruth agreed. Not always for the better. People get strange when there's fortune involved. They forget who they are. They forget what matters. Mr. Whitmore forgot, Emma said softly. He was so worried about saving his money that he trapped his family, and they all died anyway. Ruth reached across the table and took Emma's small hand in her weathered ones. The difference is, you already understand that lesson. You went into that mansion not looking for treasure, but looking for story. That's why I believe you'll handle whatever comes next with grace. That night, Emma lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind spinning with everything she'd seen, everything she'd learned. Through her window, she could see Morrison Hill and the dark shape of the log mansion silhouetted against the stars. Somewhere beneath that house, in the absolute darkness of a sealed chamber, James Whitmore's final gift waited. Use it better than I did, he'd written. Emma intended to do exactly that. By morning, word had spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. How it got out, Emma never knew. Maybe one of the people they'd told had mentioned it to someone else. Maybe a deputy had talked. Maybe small towns just had a way of knowing things before they should. By the time Emma and Ruth arrived at the mansion Sunday morning, a crowd had gathered at the base of Morrison Hill. Sheriff Parker's cruiser blocked the overgrown driveway, and 2 deputies stood guard. But that didn't stop people from shouting questions, demanding answers, insisting they had rights to see what was down there. Emma recognized faces in the crowd, neighbors, shopkeepers, the mayor and his wife, the bank president, Tommy from the school bus and his parents. Some looked excited, others looked angry. A few looked hungry in a way that made Emma's stomach twist. "There's the girl!" someone shouted, pointing at Emma. The crowd surged forward. Sheriff Parker stepped in front of Ruth and Emma, one hand on his belt near his radio. "Back off," he said firmly. "All of you. This is now a protected historical site and an active investigation. Anyone who trespasses will be arrested. That includes you, Mayor Brennan." The mayor, a thick man in his 60s who owned half the businesses in town, stepped forward with his hands raised. "Now, Sheriff, I think we all have a right to know what's been found on state property." This isn't private land. This belongs to all of us. This belongs to whoever the law decides it belongs to, Margaret Cole said, appearing at Sheriff Parker's shoulder. And until that's determined, the site is secured. I've already filed the necessary paperwork with the county and state. On whose authority? The mayor demanded. On mine. Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd, carrying a briefcase and looking thoroughly pleased with himself. As director of the County Historical Society, I have the authority to declare this site historically significant and request protection during assessment. That paperwork is also filed. So unless you want to violate state preservation laws, Mayor, I suggest you step back. The crowd grumbled but didn't disperse. Emma felt their eyes on her, some curious, some resentful, some calculating. She pressed closer to Ruth, who squeezed her hand reassuringly. Let's get inside, Sheriff Parker said quietly, before this gets uglier. They walked up the overgrown path, leaving the crowd muttering behind them. At the cellar door, Emma showed them the gap she'd squeezed through. Sheriff Parker produced a crowbar and widened it enough for adults to fit through. Then, one by one, they descended into the darkness. Emma first, then Ruth insisting on coming despite her age, then Sheriff Parker, Dr. Morrison, and Margaret Cole. Emma led them through the cellar to the hidden wall, showed them how to move the barrels, and lifted the latch on the iron door. When the tunnel opened before them, Dr. Morrison actually gasped. Good Lord, he breathed. It's real. They made their way single file through the tunnel, their flashlights dancing across the earthen walls. When they reached the chamber and their lights swept across the shelves of gold and currency, the paintings and artifacts, the leather journal sitting exactly where Emma had left it, absolute silence fell. Dr. Morrison was the first to move. He approached the nearest shelf with shaking hands, pulled out a jeweler's loupe, and examined one of the gold coins. Then another. Then a bundle of currency. He opened the journal and read, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages. This is impossible, he whispered. This is absolutely impossible. But real, Margaret said, photographing everything with her phone. But real, Dr. Morrison agreed. He looked up, his eyes shining with tears. Do you understand what this is? This isn't just money. This is a complete time capsule from 1933. These coins, some of them are rare dates. These bills, some are from series that were recalled. The paintings, if they're original, and they look original, they're worth millions on their own. And the historical significance? His voice broke. James Whitmore kept a detailed record of a family's final days during the Depression. This is priceless. Sheriff Parker had been quiet, walking slowly around the chamber, examining everything with a cop's careful eye. Now he picked up the journal and read the final entry. When he finished, he closed it gently and looked at Emma. You understood what this was, he said. You read this and understood that it wasn't about treasure. It was about tragedy. Emma nodded. He lost everything trying to save everything. And you want to make sure his loss means something. Yes, sir. Sheriff Parker handed the journal to Dr. Morrison. Then let's make sure we do this right. No rushing, no shortcuts. We document everything. We research the family tree. We follow every legal step. And we make sure that when this story gets told, it gets told true. They spent 4 hours in that chamber, photographing, measuring, cataloguing. Dr. Morrison's hands never stopped shaking. Margaret filled 3 legal pads with notes. Ruth sat on the stone floor with Emma, reading James Whitmore's journal together, both of them crying softly at the tender moments James had recorded between the careful listings of hidden assets. Notes about his children's laughter, about Margaret's strength, about ordinary family dinners that had been extraordinary simply because they were together. When they finally emerged into the afternoon light, the crowd had grown. News vans had arrived from the city 60 miles away. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, Sheriff Parker cleared his throat and addressed them all. This is an active historical site now under protection of the county and state. What has been found will be properly assessed and documented. Any claims of ownership will be handled through appropriate legal channels. That's all I'm saying today. Is there really millions down there? Someone shouted. No comment. Who does it belong to? No comment. What about the girl? Does she get a reward? Sheriff Parker looked at Emma and something like respect crossed his face. That girl's name is Emma Harris, and she showed more courage and integrity in one afternoon than most of us show in a lifetime. That's the only comment I have. He ushered Emma and Ruth back to his cruiser and drove them home through streets buzzing with speculation and excitement and greed. When he pulled up in front of their cottage, he turned in his seat to face them. It's going to get harder before it gets easier, he warned. People are going to want things from you. They're going to have opinions about what you should do, what you deserve, what's fair. Some will be genuine. Most won't. You're going to need to stay strong. We will, Ruth said firmly. Emma nodded, but inside, fear had started to curl around her ribs. She'd thought finding the fortune would be the hard part. She was beginning to realize that was just the beginning. The days following Emma's discovery blurred together in a chaos of phone calls, legal documents, and news crews that wouldn't leave Ruth and Emma alone. Their quiet cottage became a fortress under siege. Reporters knocked on the door at all hours. Strangers showed up claiming to be distant relatives of the Whitmores, demanding access to the fortune. The mayor called 3 times in one day, each time with a different reason why the town council should have oversight of the discovery. Ruth unplugged the phone on day 3. We need peace to think, she told Emma, pulling the curtains closed against another camera crew setting up on their lawn. And you need to get back to school. But school had become impossible. The other children treated Emma like a celebrity or a pariah, no in between. Teachers asked inappropriate questions about the treasure. The principal called Ruth in for a meeting to discuss whether Emma's distraction was affecting the learning environment. By Friday of that first week, Ruth was homeschooling Emma at the kitchen table, teaching her math with the household budget and history with James Whitmore's journal, which Dr. Morrison had allowed them to photocopy. On Saturday morning, Sheriff Parker arrived at dawn. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept properly since the discovery. He accepted Ruth's offer of coffee and sat heavily at their kitchen table. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Actually, we've got several problems, but one big one. The state is sending assessors on Monday. They're bringing lawyers, historians, and treasury officials. They're going to want to remove everything from that chamber for evaluation and safekeeping. That makes sense, Ruth said carefully. It should be protected. It should, Sheriff Parker agreed. But here's the thing. Once it's removed and in state custody, the legal battle over who owns it becomes a nightmare. The state will claim it belongs to them since they own the property. Any Whitmore descendants will fight for inheritance rights. The town will argue it should benefit the community. And Emma. He looked at the girl sitting quietly with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate. You'll be lucky to get a commemorative plaque and a handshake. That doesn't seem fair, Emma said softly. It's not. That's why Margaret Cole has been working around the clock on your behalf. She's found some legal precedents that might help, but we need more. We need to document everything that's down there before the state takes over. And we need to explore the rest of those tunnels. Emma sat up straighter. There's more? Sheriff Parker pulled out a folded paper, a crude map Dr. Morrison had sketched based on the tunnel they'd already explored. The tunnel you found doesn't end at that chamber. There's another passage leading deeper, and based on the original house blueprints from 1892, we think there might be an entire network down there. Your chamber might just be the first of several. Ruth set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "You want to take my granddaughter back into those tunnels. I want Emma to show us what else is down there before the state seals it up and we lose the chance to fully document the find. With her permission. And yours." Ruth looked at Emma. "What do you think, sweetheart?" Emma thought about James Whitmore's journal, about his careful documentation of everything he'd hidden. If there were more chambers, more secrets, didn't they deserve to be found? Didn't his story deserve to be told completely? "I want to go," Emma said, "but I want Grandma to come too." And that's how, 2 hours later, Emma found herself back in the cellar of the log mansion, this time with a proper expedition. Sheriff Parker had brought heavy-duty flashlights, safety equipment, and Deputy Chen, a young woman who'd done cave exploration as a hobby. Dr. Morrison arrived with surveying tools and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. Margaret Cole came to document everything for legal purposes. And Ruth, despite her 68 years and protesting knees, insisted on being part of the team. They gathered in the chamber Emma had found first, their lights creating strange shadows on the brick walls. Dr. Morrison had already marked several items with numbered tags, creating a preliminary catalogue. But today, they weren't focused on what was already found. They were looking for what remained hidden. "There," Deputy Chen said, pointing to the back wall. In the chaos of the first discovery, they'd missed it. Another iron door, smaller than the first, partially concealed behind a stack of wooden crates that Dr. Morrison had assumed were just storage. Together, Sheriff Parker and Deputy Chen moved the crates aside, revealing the door fully. This one had a lock, an old combination lock, its brass face green with age. "Now what?" Ruth asked. Emma pulled out James Whitmore's journal. She'd read it so many times in the past week that she'd memorized sections. She flipped to a page near the end and read aloud, "I have secured the primary vault with the combination known only to Margaret and myself. Should anything happen to us both, the numbers correspond to our children's birth dates, in order of their arrival: Victoria, James Jr., Sarah." "Do we know their birth dates?" Deputy Chen asked. Dr. Morrison was already pulling out his research folder, fingers trembling with excitement. Victoria was born April 7th, 1920. James Jr. was born November 12th, 1922. Sarah was born January 30th, 1925. Sheriff Parker approached the lock. "So that would be 4, 7, 20, 11, 12, 22, 1, 30, 25. "The lock only has room for 6 numbers, Deputy Chen observed, examining it closely. "Try the months and days only. 4, 7, 11, 12, 1, 30. Sheriff Parker carefully turned the dial. 4, 7, 11, 12, 1, 30. The lock clicked. He pulled it gently, and it opened in his hand. "Good Lord!" he breathed. The door swung inward, heavier than the first, revealing not another tunnel, but a descending staircase carved from stone. The air that rolled out was different, colder, drier, carrying a scent that made Emma think of her grandmother's root cellar and old libraries combined. They descended single file, Deputy Chen leading with her climbing experience, followed by Sheriff Parker, then Emma, Ruth, Dr. Morrison, and Margaret bringing up the rear. The staircase was steep and narrow, the walls pressing close. Emma counted 23 steps before they reached the bottom and emerged into a space that made everyone stop and stare. This chamber was larger than the first, maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling that arched overhead in a perfect dome. But it wasn't the architecture that stole their breath. It was what the room contained. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, and on those shelves sat items that belonged in museums. Paintings in ornate frames, some as large as Emma was tall, sculptures of marble and bronze, display cases containing jewelry that sparkled even in the dim flashlight beams, books, hundreds of books, leather-bound first editions arranged with careful precision, furniture that looked like it had been carved by master craftsmen, china sets behind glass, silver service pieces that gleamed like captured moonlight. "This isn't just a fortune," Dr. Morrison whispered, his voice shaking. "This is a collection. James Whitmore wasn't just hiding money. He was preserving an entire legacy of art and culture." Deputy Chen moved along one wall, examining the construction. "These shelves are built into the foundation. This was planned from the beginning, when the house was built." "The grandfather," Emma said suddenly, pulling out the journal again. "James wrote that his grandfather built the tunnels but never explained why. What if the whole house was designed with this purpose from the start? What if the Whitmores always planned to create a sanctuary?" Sheriff Parker was photographing everything with his department camera, the flash creating strange bursts of light in the darkness. "The question is, sanctuary from what? In 1892 there was no Great Depression, no reason to hide wealth like this." "Maybe they knew something we didn't," Ruth said quietly. She'd moved to one of the paintings, a landscape of Hollow Creek as it must have looked a century ago, pristine and wild. "Maybe they understood that empires fall, that wealth is only as secure as the world around it. Maybe they were just prudent." Margaret was taking notes faster than Emma had ever seen anyone write. "The legal implications here are staggering. This isn't found treasure. This is a preserved estate. The documentation alone could establish provenance and ownership in ways we never expected." "Look at this," Deputy Chen called from the far side of the chamber. She'd found another door, this one standing partially open. Beyond it, more stairs descended even deeper. "How far down does this go?" Ruth asked, and Emma heard the edge of fear in her grandmother's voice. "Only one way to find out," Sheriff Parker said, but he looked uncertain too. They descended again, the air growing colder with each step. This staircase was longer. Emma counted 41 steps, and opened into a third chamber that made the previous discoveries seem almost ordinary. This room was smaller but more secure, with walls of solid stone and a massive iron door that stood open, its locking mechanism intricate and beautiful, like something from a bank vault. Inside this final chamber they found the true fortune. Gold bars stacked like bricks, each stamped with dates from the 1920s and early 30s. Paper currency in sealed containers, perfectly preserved from denominations Emma didn't know existed. Stock certificates from companies long defunct and companies that still existed, worth potentially millions, bonds and securities, deeds to properties across 3 states. And in the center of the room, in a glass case all its own, a simple wooden box. Dr. Morrison approached it with trembling hands. The case wasn't locked. He lifted the lid carefully and removed the box, then opened that too. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a letter sealed with red wax. "Should I?" he asked, looking at Sheriff Parker. "We've come this far," the sheriff replied. Dr. Morrison broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His eyes moved across the page, and his face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. "What?" Emma asked, unable to help herself. "What does it say?" Dr. Morrison's hands shook as he read aloud. "To whoever finds this, you have discovered 3 generations of Whitmore labor, sacrifice, and hope. This fortune represents not just wealth, but the dreams of a family who believed in building something lasting. My grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, began this collection in 1867 after the Civil War, when he witnessed how quickly civilization could crumble. He spent his life acquiring not just wealth, but culture, art, beauty, things he believed humanity needed to preserve. My father, Robert, continued the work, expanding the tunnels, securing the chambers, always preparing for the day when the world might need these treasures protected. I, James Whitmore, made the mistake of believing that day would never come in my lifetime. The depression proved me wrong. By the time I understood the danger, it was too late to save anything but these possessions. I lost my family trying to protect wealth. That is my eternal shame and regret. But perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. If you have found this letter, you have also found documents in the chamber above that list every item in this collection, its origin, and its value as of 1933. I estimate the total worth at $4,600,000. Dr. Morrison's voice cracked, but he continued, "Adjusted for inflation and the current value of gold, art, and collectibles, I estimate that sum would be worth—" He stopped, did mental math, and his face went even paler. "Somewhere between $250 and $300 million today." Silence fell like a stone. Emma felt the weight of it, the impossible enormity of what she'd stumbled into. $250 million. More money than she could conceptualize. More than Hollow Creek's entire annual budget. More than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. "There's more," Dr. Morrison said, his voice barely audible now. James writes, "I leave 3 instructions for whoever claims this fortune. First, document everything. Tell the story truthfully. Let people know what fear and pride cost me. Second, honor my family's memory. My wife Margaret, my daughter Victoria, my son James Jr., and my daughter Sarah all died because I valued security over connection. Let them be remembered for who they were, not what they owned. Third, use this wealth better than we did. We accumulated and preserved it, but we never understood that the true value of anything lies in what it gives to the world, not what it takes from it. Be wiser than the Whitmores. Be braver. Be better." Signed, James Whitmore, October 3, 1933. Postscript. I have left one final chamber unsealed. In it, you will find something more valuable than all the gold in this mountain. You will find us. Emma's blood ran cold. Another chamber? Deputy Chen had already found it, not a door this time, but a passage cut into the natural stone, leading away from the vault chamber into darkness that seemed to swallow light. Without speaking, they followed it single file, none of them wanting to, all of them needing to. The passage opened into a natural cave that had been partially worked by human hands, and there, arranged with heartbreaking care on stone biers, lay 4 bodies. 2 adults and 2 children, preserved by the cold, dry air and whatever chemicals James Whitmore had used. They looked like they were sleeping. The woman, Margaret, wore a blue dress, her hands folded across her chest. The children were arranged beside her, the oldest daughter perhaps 14, the youngest maybe 8. And slightly apart, as if he'd wanted them to rest together without him, lay James Whitmore himself. On a small table beside his body sat another journal and a photograph. In the photograph, the family stood in front of the log mansion in sunlight, all of them smiling, all of them alive. The journal lay open to its final page. "I go to join them now," the entry read. "Whatever afterlife awaits, I pray it allows me to apologize for eternity. To whoever reads this, I was not a bad man. I was simply a frightened one. And fear, unchecked, is the most dangerous force in the world. Learn from my mistakes. Love what you have while you have it. And never ever put treasure before truth." Ruth was crying silently, tears streaming down her weathered face. Dr. Morrison had removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even Sheriff Parker looked shaken. Margaret Cole stood frozen, her notebook forgotten. Emma moved forward slowly until she stood beside James Whitmore's body. He looked younger than she'd imagined, maybe 40 years old, with a face that might have been kind if it hadn't been marked by grief. She thought about the journal entries she'd read, about the love he'd had for his children, about ordinary dinners and laughter and the small moments that made a life. "I'll tell your story," Emma whispered. "I promise. And I'll make sure people remember that you loved them, not that you lost them." She felt Ruth's hand on her shoulder. They stood together in that underground chamber, surrounded by more wealth than they could spend and more sorrow than they could bear. "We need to call this in properly," Sheriff Parker said finally, his voice rough. "This isn't just a historical find anymore. This is a burial site. We'll need the coroner, the state archaeologist, maybe even federal authorities." "The family deserves proper burial," Ruth said firmly. "Whatever else happens, those babies deserve to rest in consecrated ground with their names remembered." "Agreed," Margaret said, finding her voice again. "I'll handle the legal paperwork. This changes everything about the claim. This fortune wasn't abandoned. It was entrusted. And James left clear instructions about what he wanted done with it." They made their way back up through the chambers, through the tunnels, back to daylight that seemed too bright, too normal after the darkness below. While Sheriff Parker called for backup and Dr. Morrison contacted the state authorities, Emma and Ruth sat on the overgrown lawn of the log mansion, neither of them speaking. Finally, Ruth broke the silence. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" "I'm thinking about what Mr. Whitmore wrote, that the true value of anything is what it gives to the world. And I'm thinking that $250 million could give a lot to Hollow Creek, to people like us who are barely making it, to the school that's falling apart, to families who are one emergency away from losing everything." "That's a beautiful thought," Ruth said gently. "But Emma, you need to understand. People are going to fight over this money. The state, the town, anyone who can claim a connection to the Whitmores. It's going to get ugly, and people are going to look at you differently now. Some will see you as a hero. Others will see you as an obstacle to their own piece of the fortune." As if to prove her point, 3 black cars pulled up the overgrown drive. From them emerged people in expensive suits, lawyers, Emma guessed, or government officials. Behind them came the mayor, flanked by members of the town council, and behind them, media vans started arriving, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones. Sheriff Parker moved to intercept them, but the mayor pushed past. He was a large man with a red face and a voice used to being obeyed. "Sheriff Parker, I'm invoking town council authority over this property. The state has agreed to allow local governance pending legal resolution of the find. That means everything in those tunnels falls under town jurisdiction." "That's not how this works," Margaret Cole said, stepping forward with her own briefcase. "The finder has legal rights. The property ownership is in dispute. And most importantly, there are human remains down there that require proper handling before anyone takes jurisdiction over anything. What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal truths nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the smallest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." The mayor's face darkened. "The girl is 8 years old. She has no legal standing to claim—" "The girl has a name," Ruth said, standing up with surprising force. "Her name is Emma Harris, and she found that fortune because she had the courage to look where everyone else was too afraid to go. She documented it properly. She followed the law, and she's shown more integrity in 1 week than this town council has shown in a decade." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Emma saw faces she recognized, the librarian who'd always been kind to her, the owner of the hardware store, families from the poor side of town like her and Ruth. And she saw other faces too, the banker who'd foreclosed on 3 farms last year, the developer who'd been buying up property, the mayor's wealthy friends who'd never spoken to Emma in her life. The division was clear. those who had something to lose and those who had everything to gain. One of the lawyers from the state cars stepped forward. "I'm Jonathan Pierce from the State Treasury Department. I need to inform everyone here that pending investigation, this site is under state protection. No one enters without authorization. No one removes anything, and any disputes about ownership will be handled through proper legal channels." He turned to Margaret. "I assume you're representing the finder?" "I am. Margaret Cole, attorney at law." "Good. We'll need to schedule a meeting with all interested parties. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. at the county courthouse. Until then, this site is sealed." The mayor sputtered. "You can't just—" "I can," Jonathan Pierce said calmly. "And I am. Sheriff Parker, I'm requesting your department maintain security on this property until state marshals arrive. Anyone who attempts to enter will be arrested for tampering with a state investigation." Sheriff Parker nodded, looking relieved. "You heard the man. Everyone not authorized needs to clear out. That means you too, Mayor." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, still muttering and arguing, Jonathan Pierce approached Emma. He crouched down to her eye level, and his stern face softened slightly. "You're Emma Harris?" "Yes, sir." "You did something remarkable and brave. But I need you to understand, this is going to get complicated. A lot of people are going to want things from you. A lot of people are going to have opinions about what should happen with what you found. My job is to make sure it's handled legally and fairly. Can you trust me to do that?" Emma looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. "Will you make sure the Whitmore family gets buried properly, with their names on the stones?" Jonathan Pierce blinked, clearly not expecting that question. Yes, I'll make sure that happens." "Then I trust you." He nodded slowly, then stood and turned to Margaret. "Your client has good instincts. Make sure nobody corrupts them." That night, Emma and Ruth's cottage was under protection. A deputy sat in a car outside, discouraging the reporters and curiosity seekers who kept trying to approach. Inside, Ruth made soup and cornbread, while Emma sat at the kitchen table with her homework, real homework now, because Dr. Morrison had offered to continue tutoring her in exchange for helping document the Whitmore collection. "Grandma," Emma said, looking up from her math problems, "what if we can't keep any of it? What if the state takes it all?" Ruth set down her ladle and came to sit beside Emma. "Then we'll have given the Whitmores what they really wanted, their story told true. That's worth more than money, sweetheart. People can steal your fortune, but they can't steal your truth. Not if you hold tight to it." "But we need money," Emma said softly. "Our rent is due next week. You're working double shifts. My shoes have holes. We've managed this long. We'll manage longer if we need to." Ruth cupped Emma's face in her weathered hands. "Listen to me. That fortune down there, it destroyed a family. It's sitting on top of 4 graves. If we gain the whole world but lose who we are, what have we really won?" "Nothing," Emma whispered. "That's right. So we stay true. We fight fair. We remember what Mr. Whitmore learned too late, that love matters more than gold." She kissed Emma's forehead. "Now finish your math. Even future inheritors of fortunes need to know their multiplication tables." Emma smiled, despite everything, and returned to her homework. But her mind kept drifting back to the underground chambers, to the careful way James Whitmore had preserved not just wealth, but beauty, to his final words about using it better than he had. She had an idea forming, something that felt right in a way she couldn't quite explain yet. But it was there, growing stronger with each passing hour. By morning, she knew what she needed to do. At 9 a.m., the county courthouse was packed. Emma and Ruth sat at a table with Margaret Cole, facing a panel that included Jonathan Pierce from the state, Mayor Brennan and the town council, Dr. Morrison representing the Historical Society, and 3 lawyers who'd appeared claiming to represent potential Whitmore heirs discovered through genealogical research. The judge, a woman named Sandra Warren, who'd served Hollow Creek for 30 years, called the meeting to order. This is a preliminary hearing to establish the basic facts and legal standing regarding the discovery at the Whitmore estate. Mr. Pierce, would you begin? Jonathan Pierce stood. The state of Oregon recognizes Emma Harris as the legal finder of the Whitmore collection. Under state law, she is entitled to finder's compensation, typically 10 to 25% of the appraised value, provided no legal heir can be established. However, the discovery of human remains and documentation establishes this as an estate matter, not simply a treasure find. That complicates everything. One of the heir lawyers jumped up. Your Honor, we represent 3 individuals who can trace direct lineage to Samuel Whitmore, James Whitmore's grandfather, under inheritance law. Your clients are 6th-generation descendants at best, Margaret interrupted. James Whitmore's letter constitutes a will. He left specific instructions. Those instructions don't mention distant relatives. They mention honoring his immediate family and using the fortune wisely for the community. Mayor Brennan stood. Which is exactly why the town council should have authority. This fortune belongs to Hollow Creek. It should benefit Hollow Creek citizens. Some Hollow Creek citizens more than others? Ruth said quietly but clearly. The room went silent. Forgive me for speaking out of turn, Judge Warren, but I've lived in this town 68 years. I've watched the council make decisions that benefit the wealthy while the rest of us barely survive. My granddaughter found that fortune. She followed every rule. She showed more character than most adults in this room. And I won't sit here and watch her be pushed aside so the same people who've always had everything can take this too. Judge Warren studied Ruth for a long moment. Mrs. Harris makes a point. This court will not allow the finder to be marginalized due to her age or economic status. Continue, Mr. Pierce. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat. The state's position is this. The collection must be appraised professionally. The human remains must be handled according to state law, proper burial, historical documentation, respect for the deceased. Any legal claims must be substantiated with proof, and the finder's rights must be protected throughout the process. That's going to take time, possibly months. Meanwhile, Margaret added, Emma and Ruth Harris are facing immediate financial pressure. They deserve at minimum an advance on any eventual finder's fee. Judge Warren nodded. Agreed. I'm ordering the state to provide a preliminary payment of $50,000 to Emma Harris, held in trust until her 18th birthday, with Ruth Harris as guardian having access to funds for Emma's care and education. That's not charity. It's recognition of her rights as finder. The mayor started to object, but Judge Warren cut him off with a look. I'm also ordering that Hollow Creek's town council have no direct authority over this matter. Too many conflicts of interest. The state will handle it with oversight from this court. We'll reconvene in 30 days for a status update. Until then, the site remains sealed. This hearing is adjourned. As people filed out, some grumbling, some satisfied, Emma felt Ruth's hand squeeze hers. $50,000. It wasn't $250 million, but it was more than they'd ever had. It was security. It was new shoes and paid rent and Ruth not working herself to exhaustion. But more than that, it was validation. The system had seen them, had protected them, had said their truth mattered. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Sheriff Parker and Deputy Chen created a barrier. As they escorted Emma and Ruth to their car, one reporter managed to shout a question. Emma, what will you do with the money if you get it? Emma stopped. She looked at the reporter, then at the crowd, then back at the log mansion visible on Morrison Hill in the distance. I'll do what Mr. Whitmore asked, she said clearly. I'll use it better than he did. I'll make sure it helps people. I'll make sure his family is remembered for love, not loss. And I'll make sure Hollow Creek becomes the kind of place worth living in, not just surviving in." The crowd went quiet. Then, slowly, someone started clapping, then another, then more, until half the people outside that courthouse were applauding an 8-year-old girl who'd reminded them what integrity looked like. Emma Harris had found a fortune. But what she was really discovering was something far more valuable. Her own voice, her own strength, and the power of holding tight to what was right, even when the whole world wanted to pull you in different directions. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time, Emma wasn't afraid. She had Ruth. She had allies. And she had the truth. That, she was learning, was worth more than all the gold in the mountain. The $50,000 hit Ruth's bank account on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, everyone in Hollow Creek knew about it. Money has a way of traveling faster than light in small towns, especially when most people are struggling to make ends meet. Emma and Ruth went to the grocery store that evening, needing basics like milk and bread, and felt the shift immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who'd worked the checkout counter for 20 years and had always been kind to Ruth, rang up their items without making eye contact. When Ruth tried to pay, Mrs. Patterson said coldly, "Must be nice not having to worry about prices anymore." Ruth's hand froze over her wallet. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Some of us still have to work for a living while others get handed fortunes for stumbling into old houses." Emma felt her face burn. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't stumbled into anything, that she'd been brave when everyone else was afraid, that the money was held in trust and they'd barely touched it except to pay overdue bills. But the words stuck in her throat. Ruth took Emma's hand and led her out of the store without another word, leaving their groceries on the counter. As they walked to their car, Emma heard whispers following them, felt eyes tracking their every move. The girl who'd been invisible for 8 years was now impossible to ignore, and not everyone was happy about it. "People are scared," Ruth said as they drove home. "When someone like us gets something good, it reminds them of everything they don't have. It's easier to resent you than to face their own situation." "But we didn't do anything wrong," Emma said, her voice small. "No, baby, we didn't. But sometimes doing everything right still makes people angry." The next blow came Monday morning. Ruth answered a knock at the door to find a man in an expensive suit holding a briefcase. Behind him stood Mayor Brennan and 2 other men Emma recognized from town council meetings broadcast on the local access channel. "Mrs. Harris," the suited man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Douglas Cartwright. I'm an attorney representing several concerned citizens of Hollow Creek. May we come in?" "No," Ruth said flatly. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it from the porch." Douglas Cartwright's smile tightened. "Very well. I'm here to inform you that we're filing a lawsuit on behalf of the town. We're claiming that the Whitmore fortune, discovered on state property within town limits, constitutes a community asset. We're seeking an injunction to prevent any dispersal of funds until the matter is settled in court." "Judge Warren already ruled on this," Ruth said. "The state has jurisdiction." "Judge Warren is a county judge. We're taking this to federal court. The amount involved, we're estimating it at $275 million after professional appraisal, triggers federal oversight." He pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it to Ruth. "You're being served. Your attorney will receive the same paperwork today." Mayor Brennan stepped forward, his voice oozing false concern. "Ruth, this doesn't have to be adversarial. If you and the girl would simply agree to place the assets in a community trust administered by the town council, with appropriate compensation for Emma as the finder, of course, we could resolve this quickly. 10% seems fair. That's $27 million, more than enough for your needs." "And the other 90% goes where?" Ruth asked sharply. "Into development projects that benefit your real estate friends? Into contracts with companies you have stakes in?" Mayor Brennan's face reddened. That's a serious accusation. It's a reasonable question, and the answer is no. Emma found that fortune. James Whitmore left instructions. We're honoring those instructions, not handing everything over to people who've never cared about this town's struggling families. Douglas Cartwright's pleasant facade cracked. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Harris. We have resources, legal teams, time. How long do you think you can afford to fight us? That 50,000 will disappear fast once legal bills start mounting. Get off my porch, Ruth said quietly, and don't come back without a warrant. After they left, Ruth leaned against the closed door, her hands shaking. Emma had been watching from the hallway, fear coiling tight in her stomach. Grandma, what are we going to do? Ruth straightened, something fierce lighting in her eyes. We're going to fight, and we're going to win. But first, we need to call Margaret. Margaret Cole arrived within the hour, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table going through the lawsuit paperwork. Margaret's jaw grew tighter with each page she read. This is aggressive, she said finally. They're not just claiming town rights. They're questioning your competency as a guardian, Ruth. They're suggesting Emma was trespassing when she found the tunnels. They're even implying the discovery might have been staged. Staged? Emma burst out. How could we stage finding something that's been there for 90 years? They're reaching, Margaret said, which means they're desperate. But desperate people are dangerous. She set down the papers and looked at them both seriously. I need to be honest with you. My firm is small. I handle wills, property disputes, local cases. This is federal court, multiple plaintiffs, potentially years of litigation. I'm not sure I'm enough. Then we'll find more help, Ruth said. Who else can we trust? The answer came from an unexpected source. That afternoon, Dr. Morrison called with news. I've been researching the Whitmore family tree, trying to establish if there are any legitimate heirs. And I found something interesting, actually, something remarkable. What? Emma asked, holding the phone while Ruth listened on the other extension. James Whitmore had a younger sister named Elizabeth. She married and moved to Portland in 1918. Changed her last name to Camden. She had 3 children, one of whom had a daughter named Ruth Eleanor Camden, born in 1957. Silence on the line. Then Ruth's voice, barely a whisper. My mother's name was Ruth Eleanor Camden. I know, Dr. Morrison said gently. Your mother married a Harris and moved to Hollow Creek in 1975. You were born Ruth Camden Harris in 1957 in Portland. Your grandmother's maiden name was Whitmore. Ruth, you're Elizabeth Whitmore's granddaughter. You're James Whitmore's great-great-niece. And Emma is his great-great-great-niece. The phone nearly slipped from Emma's hand. Ruth sank into a chair, her face pale. My mother never talked about her family. She said they'd all died, that there was nothing to tell. Maybe she didn't know, Dr. Morrison said. Or maybe the shame of what happened to James and his family was too much. The tuberculosis, the tragedy. It was all hushed up at the time. People were terrified of the disease. The whole incident was buried, literally and figuratively. What does this mean legally? Ruth asked. It means Emma isn't just the finder. She has a legitimate claim as a descendant. The distant relatives who showed up claiming inheritance rights are 7th or 8th generation. Emma is direct line, 4th generation. Her claim supersedes theirs by law. Margaret Cole, who'd been listening silently, suddenly laughed. It started as a chuckle and built into full-throated joy. This changes everything. The town can't claim community asset status if there's a direct heir. The state's position shifts, and those lawyers who've been circling like sharks just lost their biggest argument. She looked at Ruth and Emma with fierce pride. We don't just have a case anymore, we have the case. We can fight this and win. But winning, they quickly learned, came with a price. By the end of the week, things in Hollow Creek had turned ugly. Someone spray-painted "thief" across the side of Ruth's car. Emma's old school called to say there had been incidents, and perhaps it was best if she continued homeschooling indefinitely. The landlord of their cottage stopped by to inform them the rent was doubling next month. Market rates, he claimed, though everyone knew it was pressure to force them out. More disturbing were the threats. Letters arrived with no return address, some merely angry, others genuinely frightening. "You don't deserve that money. Give it back before something bad happens. Little girls who steal end up hurt." Ruth reported them to Sheriff Parker, who documented everything but admitted his hands were tied unless someone made a direct threat he could prove. Then came the break-in. Emma and Ruth returned from meeting with Margaret to find their front door jimmied open, the cottage ransacked. Nothing valuable was taken. They didn't have anything valuable. But the message was clear. Someone wanted them scared. Someone wanted them to know they weren't safe. Sheriff Parker arrived with Deputy Chen and a forensics kit. As they dusted for prints, Emma sat on the couch hugging her knees while Ruth gave her statement. The violation of their small home felt worse than any of the legal threats. This was personal. This was meant to break them. "I'm assigning protection," Sheriff Parker said. "A deputy will be outside 24/7 until this settles." "Can you afford that?" Ruth asked. "The town council controls your budget." Sheriff Parker's jaw tightened. "Let them try to stop me. Some things matter more than politics." That night, with Deputy Chen parked outside and Ruth trying to clean up the mess, Emma sat at the kitchen table with James Whitmore's journal, the copy Dr. Morrison had made for her. She read the entries about his children, about ordinary days filled with small joys. She read his regrets, his final understanding that fear had destroyed what he'd been trying to protect. "I won't let them make me afraid," she said quietly. Ruth looked up from sweeping broken glass. "What, sweetheart?" "The people doing this, they want us scared. They want us to give up. But Mr. Whitmore wrote that fear unchecked is the most dangerous force in the world. I won't give them that power over me." Ruth set down the broom and came to kneel beside Emma's chair. "You're 8 years old. You shouldn't have to be this brave. But I am 8, and I am brave. And I found something that could change everything for people like us, for families struggling like we were. I can't give up just because some people are mean." Ruth pulled Emma into a hug, and they stayed like that for a long time, holding tight to each other while the world tried to shake them loose. The community split happened gradually, then all at once. It started with small gestures. The librarian who quietly renewed Emma's books with no late fees, even though they'd been overdue for weeks. The hardware store owner who fixed Ruth's broken porch step for free. The waitress at the diner who brought them extra pie and whispered, "Don't let them break you." But for every quiet supporter, there was loud opposition. A group calling itself Concerned Citizens for Fair Distribution held rallies outside the courthouse, demanding the fortune be returned to the people. The local newspaper, owned by one of Mayor Brennan's associates, ran editorials questioning Emma's story, suggesting the whole thing might be an elaborate fraud. Things came to a head at a town hall meeting 3 weeks after the discovery. Ruth insisted on attending despite Margaret's concerns. "If we hide, they win," she said. Emma stayed home with Deputy Chen, but Ruth recorded the meeting on her phone. The high school gymnasium was packed. Mayor Brennan stood at the podium, flanked by town council members and Douglas Cartwright. He began with reasonable-sounding concerns about transparency and community benefit, but the crowd wasn't interested in nuance. Someone shouted, "Where's the girl? Too scared to face us?" "Emma Harris is 8 years old," came a voice from the back. Sheriff Parker stood up, his uniform crisp, his expression hard. "She's a child who found something important and did everything right." Anyone here want to explain why an 8-year-old has more integrity than most of the adults in this room? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mayor Brennan tried to regain control. Sheriff, with respect, this isn't about the girl's character. It's about proper distribution of a community asset. It's not a community asset. Dr. Morrison stood now, his normally mild voice carrying authority. I've documented Emma Harris's direct lineage to James Whitmore. She is his great-great-great-niece. Under inheritance law, she has first claim to the estate. The town has no legal standing. The gymnasium erupted. Half the crowd shouted in protest. The other half, the poorer half, Emma would realize later when she watched the recording, cheered. The division wasn't just about the money. It was about every resentment, every inequality, every time the wealthy had benefited while the struggling went ignored. This is about power, Ruth said, standing up. The crowd quieted, surprised to see the quiet woman from the poor part of town speaking. You want to talk about fairness? Let's talk about fairness. Let's talk about how the council approved that new shopping center on land you bought cheap from desperate farmers. Let's talk about the school budget that got cut while the mayor's office got renovated. Let's talk about every time people like me and Emma needed help and got nothing but excuses. That's not relevant, Mayor Brennan started. It's completely relevant, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger. Because this isn't about Emma finding a fortune. It's about people like us finally having a chance at something better, and people like you being terrified we might actually get it. The gymnasium exploded into chaos. Some people stood and applauded. Others shouted accusations. 2 council members tried to grab the microphone from Ruth. Sheriff Parker and 3 deputies had to intervene to prevent things from getting physical. In the end, the meeting was called off. Ruth left surrounded by supporters and opponents alike, needing Deputy Chen to escort her safely to her car. When she got home and showed Emma the recording, Emma watched in awe and fear. The battle lines were drawn. Hollow Creek was splitting apart, and she and Ruth were at the center of the divide. But allies were emerging too. The next morning, a lawyer named Patricia Huang showed up at their door. She was from San Francisco, specialized in estate law and inheritance cases, and had read about the Whitmore discovery in the news. I'm offering my services pro bono, she said, sitting at their kitchen table. What's happening to you is wrong, and more than that, it's illegal. Mayor Brennan and his council are engaging in harassment and intimidation. I want to not only defend your claim to the inheritance, but sue them for their behavior. Margaret Cole, who'd been working herself to exhaustion, nearly wept with relief. Together, she and Patricia began building a comprehensive legal strategy. They documented every threat, every incident, every overreach by the town council. They prepared inheritance claims, finders' rights arguments, and historical documentation of Emma's lineage. Dr. Morrison contributed genealogical research that was ironclad. He'd found birth certificates, marriage licenses, and family records going back to 1867. He'd even located a photograph of Elizabeth Whitmore, James's sister, and Ruth's grandmother looked so much like Ruth that the family resemblance was undeniable. Sheriff Parker provided another crucial piece. While investigating the break-in, he'd discovered something interesting. The fingerprints didn't match anyone in their database, but they did match prints found at another scene, the log mansion itself. Someone had broken into the secured site, trying to access the tunnels. And security footage Dr. Morrison had installed showed a figure near the cellar entrance 2 nights before Ruth and Emma's cottage was ransacked. Someone is trying to get to the fortune directly, Sheriff Parker said at a meeting of their growing team, Ruth, Emma, Margaret, Patricia, Dr. Morrison, and Deputy Chen. They're not just fighting legally, they're trying to steal it. Or destroy evidence, Patricia suggested. If the documentation disappeared, proving Emma's claim would be harder. We need to move the most important items to secure storage, Dr. Morrison said. The journal, the letter, the key documents. I've been working with the state to arrange proper preservation anyway, but we should prioritize the pieces crucial to the legal case. That night, under cover of darkness and with heavy security, they entered the tunnels one more time. Emma led the way, flashlight in hand, feeling like she knew these passages now as well as the rooms of her cottage. They reached the vault chamber and carefully collected James Whitmore's journals, his final letter, the deeds and documents that proved the estate's scope. But when they reached the burial chamber where the Whitmore family rested, they found something that made everyone stop cold. The chamber had been disturbed, not by them. They'd been careful to leave everything exactly as found. But someone else had been there. Footprints in the dust. One of the journals from beside James's body had been moved, its pages torn out. Who would desecrate a grave? Ruth breathed, horrified. Someone desperate, Sheriff Parker said grimly. Someone who knows their legal case is falling apart and is looking for anything they can use. As they secured the remaining items and left the tunnels, Emma felt violations settle over her like a cold blanket. This wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even just about inheritance rights. Someone had disturbed the resting place of a family who'd already suffered so much. Someone had committed an act of cruelty that went beyond greed into something darker. Back at the cottage, with the recovered documents spread across the kitchen table and Deputy Chen outside standing guard, their team made a decision. They were done being defensive. It was time to go on offense. "We're going to find out who broke into that tomb," Sheriff Parker said. "And we're going to expose everyone who's been part of this intimidation campaign. I've got investigators I trust from the state police. Let's use them. And legally," Patricia added, "we're filing our counterclaims: harassment, intimidation, civil rights violations, unlawful use of government authority. We're going after the mayor, the council, and anyone else who's crossed the line. They wanted a fight. They've got one." Emma listened to the adults planning, feeling the energy shift from desperate defense to purposeful action. She thought about James Whitmore's words about fear being the most dangerous force. These people trying to steal her inheritance were operating from fear. Fear of losing power, fear of change, fear that people like Emma and Ruth might actually matter. But Emma wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry, and more than that, she was determined. The Whitmore fortune wasn't just gold and currency. It was a chance to prove that the system could work for people like her, that courage and truth could win against money and power, that an 8-year-old girl from the poor part of town could stand up to mayors and lawyers and win. "I want to testify," Emma said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "When this goes to court, I want to tell the judge everything, about finding the tunnels, about Mr. Whitmore's journal, about why this matters. Can I do that?" Patricia studied her for a long moment. "You can. But Emma, they'll question you hard. They'll try to confuse you, to make you contradict yourself. They'll try to make you look like a liar or a child who doesn't understand what she found." "I'm not a liar," Emma said firmly. "And I understand exactly what I found. I found proof that good people can make mistakes out of fear. I found a fortune that's been hidden for 90 years, and I found out that I'm stronger than I thought I was." She looked around at the faces of people who'd become her team, her protectors, her friends. "I'm ready to fight." Ruth's eyes shone with tears and pride. "That's my granddaughter." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of their small cottage. On Morrison Hill, the log mansion stood dark against the stars, keeping its secrets and its sorrows. But inside those walls, in those deep tunnels, the truth waited. And Emma Harris, 8 years old, afraid but brave, small but strong, was going to make sure that truth came to light, no matter who tried to stop her. The battle had begun, and this time the underdogs had teeth. The federal courthouse in Portland was nothing like the small county building in Hollow Creek. It rose 12 stories, all glass and steel and intimidating authority. Emma stood on the steps beside Ruth, staring up at it while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. She wore the only dress she owned, navy blue with white flowers, shoes still scuffed despite Ruth's best efforts to polish them. She looked exactly like what she was, a small-town girl facing something much bigger than herself. "You ready?" Ruth asked, squeezing her hand. Emma nodded, though her stomach churned. "I'm ready." Inside, the courtroom was vast and formal, with high ceilings and wooden benches polished to a gleam. On one side sat Patricia Huang and Margaret Cole, with Dr. Morrison and Sheriff Parker in the row behind them. On the other side sat Douglas Cartwright and a team of 5 attorneys representing the town, the supposed Whitmore heirs, and various other claimants who'd emerged once the fortune's value became public knowledge. Mayor Brennan sat prominently in the gallery, his expression confident. Federal Judge Ellen Martinez entered, and everyone stood. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for having no patience for legal games. She'd reviewed all the briefs, all the evidence, and now she was ready to hear testimony. The first 2 days were tedious, experts arguing about property law, inheritance statutes, finders' rights, and state jurisdiction. Emma sat quietly, listening to lawyers debate her life in terms she barely understood. But on the 3rd day, Patricia called Emma to the stand. The courtroom went silent as Emma walked forward, was sworn in, and took her seat. The witness chair was too big for her. Her feet didn't touch the ground. But when she looked out at the courtroom, she found Ruth's face and held tight to it. Patricia approached gently. "Emma, can you tell the court how you first discovered the tunnels under the Whitmore mansion?" Emma took a deep breath and began. She told the story simply, truthfully, about being curious when everyone else was afraid, about squeezing through the cellar door, about finding the iron door hidden behind barrels. She described the tunnels, the chambers, the moment she first saw James Whitmore's journal. "What did you feel when you read the journal?" Patricia asked. "Sad," Emma said softly. He loved his family so much, but he was so scared of losing everything that he made choices that hurt them. He wrote that fear is the most dangerous force in the world, and I understood what he meant because I've been scared too. Scared of what? Scared that we'd lose our home. Scared that Grandma Ruth works too hard and gets too tired. Scared that I'd never be able to help make things better. Emma's voice grew stronger. But Mr. Whitmore also wrote that whoever found the fortune should use it better than he did. He wanted it to mean something, to help people. And that's what I want too. Douglas Cartwright's cross-examination was aggressive, just as Patricia had warned. He tried to confuse Emma about dates and times. He suggested she'd been coached. He implied an 8-year-old couldn't possibly understand what she'd found. "Isn't it true," he said sharply, "that your grandmother told you what to say? That she saw an opportunity to claim a fortune that doesn't belong to you?" Emma looked at him steadily. "My grandma taught me to tell the truth. That's what I'm doing. And the fortune does belong to me. Dr. Morrison proved I'm related to James Whitmore. He's my great-great-great-uncle. That makes his fortune part of my family. Your supposed family connection is through a woman who died decades ago, who never claimed any connection to the Whitmores, because she was ashamed," Emma interrupted. "Wouldn't you be ashamed if your family died from a disease while locked in their house? People were cruel about tuberculosis back then. My great-great-grandmother probably wanted to protect her children from that shame, but that doesn't erase the bloodline." Judge Martinez actually smiled. "The witness will answer only the questions asked, but I'll note her point is well taken." The testimony continued for hours. Emma answered every question, never wavering, never backing down. When Douglas Cartwright finally dismissed her, Looking frustrated and defeated, she walked back to her seat with her head high. Ruth hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." The revelation came on day 4. Dr. Morrison took the stand with a folder of documents and a discovery that changed everything. He'd been researching not just the Whitmore family tree, but also the mansion's history, trying to understand why the tunnels existed in the first place. "I found employment records from 1892, he testified, his voice trembling with excitement. Samuel Whitmore, James's grandfather, employed a man named Thomas Camden as estate manager and caretaker. Thomas Camden's primary responsibility was maintaining the underground preservation chambers. And Thomas Camden," he paused for effect, "was married to Samuel's daughter, Elizabeth Whitmore." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Patricia stood. "Dr. Morrison, what does this mean?" "It means the tunnels weren't just a hiding place. They were a legacy project built by the family, maintained by the family. Elizabeth Whitmore married the caretaker, and their descendants, including Ruth and Emma Harris, have as much claim to this estate as any direct Whitmore heir. More, actually, because they're descended from both the bloodline and the people entrusted to protect it." Douglas Cartwright shot to his feet. "Objection! This is speculation." "It's documented fact," Dr. Morrison said calmly. He pulled out employment contracts, marriage certificates, and a letter from Samuel Whitmore to his daughter dated 1893. "My dearest Elizabeth, I am pleased that Thomas has proven himself worthy of our family's trust and your hand. Together, you will guard our legacy for generations to come. The chambers beneath the house are now as much your responsibility as mine. Teach your children their importance. Let them understand that some things must be preserved, protected, and passed down." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Dr. Morrison, you're saying Emma Harris is not just a descendant, but the heir to a specific caretaking tradition?" "Exactly, Your Honor. The Whitmore fortune wasn't just hidden. It was entrusted to specific family members to protect. Emma isn't just related by blood, she's the inheritor of that trust. And given that she found the chambers, documented them properly, and sought to honor James Whitmore's final wishes, I'd say she's fulfilled that trust admirably." The courtroom erupted. Lawyers shouted over each other. Reporters scrambled for the exits to file stories. Mayor Brennan's face turned crimson with rage, and Emma sat frozen, trying to process what this meant. She wasn't just someone who'd stumbled onto a fortune. She was the person meant to find it. The legacy had been waiting for her all along. Judge Martinez called for order, then adjourned for the day. But the damage to the opposition's case was done. If Emma was the designated inheritor of the estate's protection, the town had no claim. The distant relatives had no claim. Everything shifted. That night, back at their hotel room, paid for by Patricia's firm, Ruth and Emma sat together watching the news coverage. Every channel was running the story. 8-year-old inheritor of $275 million fortune, part of century-old legacy, read one headline. Small-town girl fulfills family destiny, read another. "Do you understand what this means?" Ruth asked gently. Emma nodded slowly. "It means the fortune is really ours. It means we can do what Mr. Whitmore asked. We can use it better than he did." "And that's what you want? Not just to keep it, but to use it?" Emma thought about Hollow Creek, the struggling families, the kids wearing clothes with holes like hers used to have, the library that could barely afford books, the community center that had closed 3 years ago for lack of funding. She thought about Ruth working double shifts just to keep them fed. She thought about all the people who'd stood by them despite the pressure to turn away. "I want to help," Emma said firmly. "I want to fix things. Is that okay?" Ruth pulled her close. "That's more than okay, sweetheart. That's exactly right." The final ruling came 1 week later. Judge Martinez took her time, clearly wanting to establish precedent that would stand up to any appeal. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and decisive. This court finds that Emma Harris, as documented descendant of both Samuel Whitmore and Thomas Camden, has legitimate claim to the Whitmore estate as primary heir. The finder's rights argument, while interesting, is secondary to the inheritance claim. The town of Hollow Creek, while having a vested interest in the outcome, has no legal standing to claim the estate. The supposed heirs represented by Mr. Cartwright have failed to prove closer lineage than Miss Harris. She paused, looking directly at Emma. However, this court is also cognizant that Emma Harris is 8 years old. Therefore, I'm establishing a conservatorship with Ruth Harris as primary guardian and conservator, with oversight from the state and quarterly reporting requirements. $50 million will be placed in an immediate access fund for community development as outlined in Emma's testimony. The remainder will be held in trust, with portions released as Emma matures and demonstrates continued responsibility. She fixed Mayor Brennan with a hard stare. I'm also referring several matters to the district attorney for investigation. Specifically, the harassment and intimidation tactics employed against Miss Harris and Mrs. Harris. Threatening a child to access wealth is not just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. This court expects full cooperation from all involved. The gavel fell. Emma Harris, at 8 years old, had won. Not just the fortune, but justice, vindication, recognition that being small and young and poor didn't mean being powerless. The transformation of Hollow Creek didn't happen overnight. It took months of planning, community meetings, and careful deliberation. Emma insisted on being part of every decision, sitting at tables full of adults with her notebook and her ideas, speaking up when she saw something that didn't align with James Whitmore's vision. The first project was the Whitmore Community Center, built on land donated by the estate. It housed a food bank, free medical clinic, tutoring programs, and meeting spaces available to anyone. Emma wanted it named after James, Margaret, Victoria, James Jr. and Sarah Whitmore, remembering them as a family, not a fortune. Next came education initiatives. Emma established the Whitmore Scholarship Fund, which covered college tuition for any Hollow Creek student who maintained good grades and demonstrated community service. The first year, 12 students received full scholarships. The local school got a complete renovation, new computers, updated textbooks, a science lab that rivaled those in wealthy districts. The log mansion itself became the Whitmore Heritage Museum, documenting not just the family's story, but the history of Hollow Creek, the timber industry, and the impact of the Great Depression. The underground chambers were preserved exactly as Emma found them, accessible through guided tours that emphasized the human story over the treasure. James Whitmore's journals were displayed with his own words about fear and love taking center stage. Dr. Morrison became the museum's director. Sheriff Parker, who resigned from his position after the mayor tried to fire him for supporting Emma, became head of security. Deputy Chen joined him. They were paid well. Emma insisted on that. People who did right by her deserved to be rewarded. The town resisted at first. Mayor Brennan and his council fought every initiative, trying to block permits and create regulatory nightmares. But the FBI investigation into their intimidation campaign changed things quickly. When several council members were indicted for fraud and corruption unrelated to Emma's case, the investigation had uncovered years of financial misconduct. Emergency elections brought in new leadership. People who believed in what Emma was building. People who understood that rising tides lift all boats. Within 2 years, Hollow Creek was unrecognizable. New businesses opened, attracted by economic incentives from the Whitmore Development Fund. The main street, which had been half-empty storefronts, bustled with activity. Young families who'd left for opportunities elsewhere started moving back. The population grew from 800 to 1,200 people. Property values rose, But Emma established rent control programs to ensure long-time residents weren't displaced. The most profound change was in spirit. Hollow Creek had been dying, its people resigned to decline. Now there was hope. Emma saw it in the faces at community center events, in the kids at the refurbished school, in the families lining up for the food bank without shame because Emma had made it clear, help wasn't charity. It was community. Not everyone celebrated. Some people who'd fought against Emma moved away, bitter at being proven wrong. Douglas Cartwright was disbarred for ethical violations. Mayor Brennan served 18 months in prison for fraud. The newspaper that had questioned Emma's story went out of business when readers cancelled subscriptions in droves. But Emma felt no satisfaction in their downfall. She'd learned from James Whitmore that revenge was hollow. Building something better was the only victory that mattered. On Emma's 10th birthday, the town threw a celebration. Not for her specifically, she'd insisted, but for the anniversary of the discovery that had changed everything. They held it at the museum, and hundreds of people came. Emma stood beside the entrance to the tunnels, now protected by glass and security systems, and watched families explore the chambers where she'd once stood alone and afraid. Ruth found her there, pressed a kiss to her forehead. "What are you thinking about?" "About how scared I was that first day," Emma said. "When I squeezed through the cellar door, I didn't know what I'd find. I just knew I had to look." "And now?" "Now I'm glad I was brave. Because it wasn't just about finding treasure. It was about finding out who I could be." The Whitmore fortune continued to grow through careful investment and management. By Emma's 12th birthday, the initial $275 million had grown to over $300 million. Emma established satellite programs in other struggling towns, sharing the model that had worked in Hollow Creek. The Whitmore Foundation became nationally recognized for community development done right, led by local voices, respecting local culture, investing in people rather than just infrastructure. Emma herself changed too. The shy, overlooked girl grew into a confident young woman who spoke at conferences, advised nonprofits, and never forgot where she came from. She still lived in Hollow Creek, in a modest house she and Ruth built on the edge of town. Nice, but not ostentatious. She still wore jeans with grease stains from helping at the community center. She still remembered what it felt like to be invisible. On her 16th birthday, Emma visited the burial site where James, Margaret, Victoria, James Jr., and Sarah Whitmore rested. They'd been reburied with full honors in Hollow Creek Cemetery, their graves marked with beautiful stones that told their story. Emma brought flowers and sat in the grass, talking to them like old friends. "I think I did okay," she said softly. "I used your fortune the way you wanted. I helped people. I told your story true. I made sure people remember you loved each other, not that you lost each other." She paused, wiping tears. "I hope that matters. I hope you can rest now, knowing your tragedy created something beautiful." The wind rustled through the trees, and Emma chose to believe it was answer enough. The log mansion on Morrison Hill stood no longer as a symbol of fear, but of possibility. School children visited it on field trips, learning about history and courage and the power of curiosity. Tourists came from across the country to see where an 8-year-old girl had discovered not just a fortune, but a legacy. The tunnels that had once hidden treasure now revealed truth, and Ruth, who'd worked herself to exhaustion for so many years, finally rested. Not because she stopped working, she was too stubborn for that, but because the work brought joy now instead of desperation. She ran the community center's senior programs, teaching quilting and cooking and sharing stories about the old days when Hollow Creek was dying. "Look how far we've come," she'd tell people. And it started because one little girl refused to be afraid. Sometimes Emma thought about the alternate timeline, the one where she'd walked past the mansion that day, too scared to investigate, too conditioned by warnings and whispers to trust her curiosity. In that timeline, the fortune stayed buried. James Whitmore's story remained untold. Hollow Creek continued its slow decline, and Emma stayed invisible, just another poor kid with no prospects and no hope. But that wasn't what happened. Emma had been brave, and that bravery had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted, touching thousands of lives, transforming an entire community, proving that sometimes the most overlooked people carry the greatest potential. On her 18th birthday, when the full conservatorship ended and Emma gained complete legal control of the fortune, reporters asked what she planned to do. She smiled and said simply, "Keep going. There's still work to do, still people to help, still stories to tell." And that's exactly what she did. The Whitmore Foundation expanded, the programs deepened, the impact grew. But Emma never forgot the core truth that had started it all, that courage meant looking when others looked away, that legacy wasn't about what you kept, but what you gave, and that an 8-year-old girl with holes in her shoes could change the world if she was brave enough to try. Years later, when Emma stood in front of Congress advocating for community development funding, when she established the Whitmore Institute for Rural Revitalization, when she wrote a book about her experience that became required reading in leadership courses, people would ask her the same question. How did you know what to do? How did a child make such wise choices? And Emma's answer never changed. I listened to someone who learned wisdom through loss. James Whitmore taught me that fear destroys what it tries to protect, that love matters more than wealth, that the true measure of any fortune is what it gives to the world. I just had the privilege of proving he was right. The log mansion still stands on Morrison Hill, its massive timber walls dark with age, its windows reflecting sun and stars. Children play on its grounds, families picnic in its shadow, scholars study its secrets. And deep beneath its foundation, in chambers that once held treasure, now preserved as historical artifacts, James Whitmore's final words remain displayed for all to read. Use this wealth better than we did. Emma Harris did exactly that. Not because she was special or chosen or destined, but because when the moment came, when opportunity and responsibility collided in the form of an iron door hidden behind barrels, she chose courage over comfort. She chose truth over safety. She chose to believe that small hands could carry big dreams. And in doing so, she proved something that Hollow Creek and the world desperately needed to learn. That being overlooked doesn't mean being powerless. That being young doesn't mean being incapable. That being poor doesn't mean being worthless. Sometimes the people society dismisses are the ones who change it most profoundly. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. Sometimes an 8-year-old girl in worn-out shoes is exactly who the world needs. Because Emma Harris didn't just inherit a fortune. She inherited a responsibility, a legacy, a trust placed in her by people who died 90 years before she was born. And she honored that trust in ways they never could have imagined, transforming tragedy into triumph, fear into hope, buried treasure into living legacy. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to walk through doors that others fear to open, if they're willing to listen to stories buried in darkness and bring them into light, if they understand that the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but what you do with it. Emma Harris learned those lessons in underground chambers beneath a haunted mansion, and she spent her life teaching them to anyone willing to listen. Because some fortunes are measured in gold, but the richest legacy is measured in lives changed, communities restored, and courage passed from generation to generation like an inheritance more valuable than any amount of money could ever be. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will remind you why courage and compassion matter. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that overlooked voices deserve to be heard, and small acts of bravery can spark extraordinary change.